I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review. Today we're going to take a look at the Cayin N3 Ultra. This is a new digital audio player from Cayin, and it is the follow-up to the N3 Pro, if you're following along with what Cayin's doing. Now, I guess if you're not following along with what Cayin's doing, they typically make digital audio players, and they make kind of high-end digital audio players. In fact, they've got some high-end audio players. They've got tube amplifiers and all kinds of cool bells and whistles, and the N3 series has been, from the Pro and now here with the Ultra, kind of like an entry level to the high end, which is to say, this thing's got tubes in it, okay? And frankly, that's what makes this thing really pretty interesting to me. So yeah, unlike other digital audio players that have your typical solid state amplification, this thing has actually got vacuum tubes for the amplification. You can't see them, but that's what's behind these little windows. And well, that was true of the N3 Pro. So what's different here about the N3 Ultra? So some of the shortcomings that the N3 Pro has, and in fact, here's what the N3 Pro looked like for anyone curious, is the N3 Pro had like some issues with tube noise, all right? So while there are tubes inside this, there were some issues with microphonic sounds that were maybe not sounds that you wanted to hear coming through. There was also the issue that the N3 Pro, even though it's got a balanced connector, and of course it's got that tube-based amplification, you couldn't use the tubes if you were using the balanced connector, and a lot of audiophiles found that objectionable. And then the other big difference is that the N3 Pro uses an old version of Hibi OS. So what we've got here with the N3 Ultra are solutions to those three problems. As far as the tube noise, we'll talk about it, I guess, a little bit, or maybe I'll just say right now, I don't hear any tube noise. They've got a new suspension system for isolating those tubes from vibration, external sounds, to the point that they've solved it. Okay, there's the spoiler. The other thing is that, yeah, you can use the tube amplification over the balanced connector. No problem there. And then they've also changed this. So now, instead of using kind of a Linux-based Hibi OS, this thing is now running Android. But only kinda, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. But yeah, like overall, like again, why this is interesting to me is the tubes. With the N3 Pro, that is, all right, let me step back. When I review digital audio players, I very typically will tell you that they don't sound different to me. The N3 Pro is an exception to that. The tube amplification does actually make a difference. And so I was kind of curious to see, how were those improvements that we just talked about? How do they impact the experience here with the N3 Ultra, the new guy? And I don't know, is the difference that I get from the sound with the tube amplification enough for me to want to use this over your typical solid state digital audio player? And that's what we're going to talk about. Okay, I've had this thing for about a month or so, maybe even a little bit longer. I've been living with it, and we're going to talk about my experience today. So I guess without further, the one further ado, it's just a quick shout out to Cayin for sending this guy in for review. If you want to check out the N3 Pro, I've got a link in the description down below. Otherwise, let's talk about what you get inside the box of this thing. We'll talk about the physical form factor. We'll talk about what it's like to live with. We'll talk about what it sounds like. And then I will end this review with a score. And just a fair warning, my DAP reviews end up being a little bit longer than average, but I promise you it's worth it if you're interested. Okay, let's talk about the packaging. Here's the box. Nice, simple, small box. What you get inside of it is what you see here, although you don't actually get that. So it's not a ton, but you get the digital audio player itself. You get a pretty beefy USB-A to C cable, because this thing does charge over USB-C. And they do also include a little carry case, or a little protective silicone sleeve. I actually think this is a pretty well done sleeve. What I had over here, this is not included in the box, but they do sell it separately. This is their leather case. And you get to choose between using, a leather case or the silicone case. I actually think the silicone case is a better design. And while we're on the topic of it, I guess I'll just dive in and talk about why I don't love this leather case. There's a couple things. Like one, this back is a little bit cheese gratery. Two, the buttons are covered up, which I don't love. Although I will say that of all the digital audio player cases that cover up buttons, and frankly most of them do, these ones are actually somewhat easy to feel the distinction between, so I don't mind it so much there. But really the biggest issue that I have with this case, and I guess I'll throw this thing in the case for you to demonstrate, is that there's nothing covering the top of it. And so a lot of the times when I'm plugging IMs into this, I end up inadvertently pushing it out of the case. So that's kind of a bummer. Whereas here with the included silicone case, while it's silicone, it's not leather, it's not quite as nice a material, I don't have any of those problems. You can see here that the buttons are not covered up. The top of it is covered up. And then the other problem I actually didn't mention is that this thing covers up the micro SD card, whereas the silicone case does not. And that's actually important for me with this DAP in ways that it's not for other Android-based DAPs, but we'll get into that again in a little bit. Yeah, so that's what you get inside the box. Let's talk about the unit itself, and it is somewhat of a unit. You can see it's fairly thick, it's fairly beefy, but it's not overall like especially heavy or anything like that. In fact, I would say this has a pretty nice hand feel in it. You can see that it is taller than your average digital audio player. And in fact, it is a little bit larger than the N3 Pro. Let me pull this thing up for comparison. If you've tried the N3 Pro, a lot of it is, I think, because of this extended height screen, because this thing is now running Android rather than the Linux-based Hibi OS. They wanted to give you a little bit more screen real estate, and that is welcome. In fact, actually, this thing feels, maybe it's just because it's denser, but this one actually feels a little bit lighter. That's interesting. I didn't notice that until just this second. But apart from that, okay, let's do a little tour of this unit. So build quality materials on this thing are excellent, as you would probably expect from a Cayin audio player. You've got, I'm assuming, an aluminum rail all the way around. It's nice and metal. You can feel it. It feels quality. And then you've got glass both on the front and on the back. I'm not actually the biggest fan of having glass on the back of these things because it does make them quite slippery. If I put this thing on my couch, it will just start ever so slightly, gradually working its way off the couch, which is a bit of a problem. But you put it into a case like this, you won't have that problem. But otherwise, I don't know, not much to say about the quality of it. I like that they've got the connectors all on the bottom of the player. That's where I prefer them. Some people like to have the connectors on the top of a unit, but for my research, it's only about a third of people. So the majority of people like them where I do, which is on the bottom. And then of course you've got your USB-C connector down there for charging. Over here on the left side, you've got your micro SD slot, and then you've got a couple of windows for the, in fact, let me switch into this mode real quick. Oh, I need to plug something in for it to do this. Hold on. I didn't prepare for this adequately, but let's put it into tube mode. Oh no, I just switched it away from tube mode. All right. When you have this thing in tube mode, it lights up, okay? And I think it looks pretty cool, but I will say I'm pretty sure that it's just like an orange LED rather than the glow from the tubes. I haven't taken it apart to verify that, but that would be strongly my suspicion. It is interesting that they changed it so that the windows are over here, whereas on the N3 Pro, I don't have this thing powered on, but the LED, or sort of the tube glow, came from the center of it, which I thought was actually kind of a cool effect. You saw it more, whereas here it's over here on the left, and you have to tilt it to see it. So maybe not quite as fun that way, but it will still get warm, and that's part of the fun for you. And I gotta be honest, I do like the warmth that you get from a little player like this. All right, anything else to talk about? I guess let's talk about the button configuration real quick. So you've got your standard play, track skipping over here, and then you've got a real digital volume dial, which you like to see. Now, unlike the dial on the N3 Pro, this dial does not double up as your power button. In fact, they've got a separate power button up here on the top of the player. And it has both good things and bad things about it. So one, I did quibble about this knob having a little bit of wobbliness to it, but you know, it functions as kind of like a power on off button. Now this one doesn't have that clicky button, and because of that, it's more stable. But the downside is that having the power button up here is actually pretty out of the way. And I mentioned this is kind of a tall player, so when I'm holding it in my hand, this is kind of where my hand naturally rests for operating it, right? I can reach up to grab the knob, I can hit these buttons and access them, but if I want to turn the screen off or on, I have to reposition this thing in my hand entirely in order to do that. Does that sound like a small quibble? It is a small quibble, but it is nonetheless a thing that's probably going to impact your user experience of the N3 Ultra. Okay, anything else to talk about? I don't think so. So let's get into talking about the usability of the N3 Ultra. And I've kind of already alluded to this a little bit. This thing is running Android, but it's kind of Android, okay? So let's talk about it. So the processor that you get in this guy is a Snapdragon 425, which at this point is pretty old, okay? Newer Android digital audio players, let's say here's an example of a Hibi one, are running the Snapdragon 665. The 425 that's here in the N3 Ultra is one that I would have expected on an Android player maybe like 2 years ago. And the reason I prefer the 660 or the 665 is that it's more capable of running software like Spotify, all right? And if you're using a digital audio player with Android, you might want to be using Spotify. Now, that does not come into play with this device though, because you're not going to be running Spotify on this thing, okay? Here's what I mean. All right, this thing is running Android. I don't even know which version of Android it is, but it is really like a very simplified, bare bones, stripped back version of Android. There is no Google Play Store in here. And because there's no Google Play Store, you're not going to be downloading Spotify or other music playing apps. In fact, I don't even know, I haven't tried to sideload an app. I don't think I could because there's no file browser on this thing. In fact, there's no home screen, right? There's no way for me to leave the music player app. It is Android, as you can kind of see. I've got like this swipe down screen. This is all pretty Android-y. If I go into settings, you're going to say, okay, that looks a lot like an Android settings screen. In fact, I go in here into system settings, right? Like this is all pretty Android-y, but there's no home screen. There's no apps. There's just the stock music app. And that is all that you will get out of the Android experience. In fact, you won't even get Wi-Fi and Bluetooth on the N3 Ultra, which is a very interesting choice. The reason that they say that they've done that is that apparently with some of their other tube-based players, maybe this is an example, I don't even know, their customers have complained about issues with the Wi-Fi radios and the Bluetooth causing interference with the tubes. And because this thing's got tubes and they just don't want people to have that bad experience, they've gone ahead and just disabled Wi-Fi and Bluetooth in this device. So just know that when you're getting this thing, while it does technically run Android, I would not think of this as your average Android audio player. Think of this much more as a bare bones, simple audio player that just happens to be running Android under the hood. And there are some benefits to that. Like you get this app, which this is basically Hibi's music app. If you've used Hibi's music app, you should know what to expect here. If you haven't, well, I'll dive into some of the things I don't love about it, but generally it's a pretty decent little music app. And things like the scroll behavior and operation speed are going to be better than on a lot of these Linux-based audio players, or some of, even like a Sony player, like older Sony player at this point, that's using its own in-house built operating system. This thing running Android means that it scrolls smoothly and the touch controls and interface and stuff are all actually really, really well done. But that's kind of like the only benefit that you really get of this thing running Android. Now, anything else? No, let's get into the nitty gritty of this app. Things I don't love. And it basically boils down to, I think 3 things. Let's see. I'm going to guess it's 3 things. Let's dive in and talk about them. Thing number 1 that I don't love about the Hibi music app, okay, is the way that it alphabetizes artists that happen to have the word "the" in front of them, okay? All right, if I'm going through my C's, I want to listen to The Cure. Oh, The Cure, they're not here. Okay. Well, where's The Cure? The Cure is down here in the "thes." They alphabetize all of the bands next to each other, which is not what I want. I want the Cranberries and The Cure alphabetized with C's. I want Japanese House alphabetized with J, The Knife with K, etc., etc. It's a small sort of thing. You get used to it. It's just when I'm using my music library on multiple devices, other digital audio players that don't do this, or on my desktop, my laptop music library, they don't do this. So when I'm used to looking for The Cure under C, and here I have to remember that it's under the, well, that's just kind of a downside of using the Hibi app. Other things that I don't love about the Hibi app, one is that the way that these album arts load, okay, I've already got them all loaded in, so I'm not going to be able to show you, but it doesn't usually load them until like after I stop scrolling or after I release my finger from the screen. Okay, small problem, but if you happen to be browsing albums kind of visually, that can be a little bit of a problem. The bigger problem for me, let me go into Cigarettes After Sex as an example, just because I know I've got a few albums from them, is I am, one, an album listener, okay? But two, I'm also like an artist listener. I like to listen to Cigarettes After Sex, one album after the other consecutively. And unfortunately with Hibby's operating system, or this paradigm for their app, I can't. I can listen to one album by itself, or I can listen to all the albums. Basically, you can hit this button and listen to all songs from the artist. But then it just changes up the order. You can see here it's got them in like alphabetical order rather than in the order that they appear in the album. So I can't really listen to artists the way that I like to on this thing. And because it's not quite Android, I can't put my own music library software in here. So I'm stuck with that. It's kind of a small thing, but it is a thing that nonetheless I find pretty annoying. The thing that is really nice about this, however, running Hibby's operating system, let me dive into this, is that with Hibby's latest stuff, they've been including a really good parametric EQ. All right, so like a lot of audio players, you've got an EQ section in here, and you can do your normal, 10-band graphic equalizer. But more importantly is this guy, is parametric EQ. And if you're not familiar with using this, it's just like, it's EQ with superpowers, all right? There's a little bit of a learning curve. You will have to figure it out. But once you learn it, you have a lot of control over what your headphones sound like, and I love it. You get 10 bands. You can place the bands wherever you want them to. You can set the Q factor so you can make it a narrow or a wide band effect. And then of course you can set the gain so that you can reduce or increase that particular frequency. Again, if there's a little bit of a learning curve, if you're not already, I recommend using SquigLink for making these sort of modifications, because SquigLink will let you visualize what the frequency response, kind of like a stock frequency response is, and then you can kind of tailor it with the tools on SquigLink and then bring that. You can actually import the export that you get on SquigLink into here, and honestly that just makes it really cool. So I like to see that. Now technically, is this a system-wide EQ? I guess so, because there's only one app that you can use, so technically this is a system-wide EQ, which is pretty cool. And before we get into the rest of the functionality on this player, I did want to briefly complain about something, is that scanning music on it. So you put a micro SD card in there, you got to scan your music library to update it. The location of that scan setting is actually kind of hidden. It's weirdly in the folder section. And then now there's a music scan button, and then, it scans your library. It's a little bit slow, but that's pretty typical. Apart from it being in a weird location, the big problem I have with this is that, and this is again like kind of a thing with Hibby's operating system, or just their music player, is that by default, Hibby's music player will ignore short tracks. So if you have tracks in your music library that are under a minute long, the player will skip those. They'll just omit them. It'll assume that they're not intended to be music playing tracks, but I've got tracks that are short that are intended to be music playing tracks, and it's going to skip them. Now in the full-blown Hibby operating system software, there's a toggle to turn that off, that skipping. But here with the Cayin N3 Ultra, I can't find that option. If I go into audio settings, I don't see the option to disable the skipping of short tracks. So there's just certain tracks in my library that will not show up in this thing, and there's nothing I can do about it. That's kind of disappointing, I'll be honest. Yeah, I don't know. It's a very interesting choice that they've gone here with the N3 Ultra. It feels, even though it's running Android, it feels like an old school audio player in a lot of ways. In some ways, I don't actually hate it. I kind of like the simplicity of it. The fact that I can't sideload Spotify onto this thing, I don't know if I hate it. The fact that it doesn't have Wi-Fi, I do kind of hate, because I generally will sync my music library over Wi-Fi. And because this doesn't have a Wi-Fi in it, I've got to take the memory card out and sync my music library manually. And then some of those other things are like quirks that I guess I can deal with, but they are also things that make me just kind of steer more toward other audio players. Of course, you've got the tubes in there, and we'll talk about the tubes and what it sounds like. So maybe that's the reason that you want to live with it. The other thing that I want to talk about, and this is much less about the operating system, but is nonetheless an important thing about the functionality of an audio player like this is the battery life, okay? So the N3 Ultra has a 4,500 milliamp hour battery, which is, you know, a decent size for your average Android audio player. Unfortunately, the battery life on this guy is not that great. It's fine. It's like a little under 12 hours is what they claim. I think it's 11.8 hours, which is like an odd claim. And that seems about right. Like I basically have to charge this thing every day if I'm listening to it regularly, because I like to sleep with a digital audio player and then I'll listen to it sporadically. I was combining the words sporadically and periodically throughout the day. And I ideally would like to not have to charge my audio player every day. But with, you know, about 12 hours claims battery life, and that's about what I get in practice, this is the thing I got to charge every day. And that's kind of at the best case scenario. All right. That 12 hours claimed is if you're listening to it on 3.5 mil, which is what I do, and just using the solid state. If you're using the tubes on balanced, it does hit the battery life quite a bit. It goes down to about 7.5 hours of battery life. So again, I guess at that point, honestly, the difference between 7.5 hours versus 12 hours is not that big. I'm still going to be having to charge this thing every day. But yeah, just kind of expect, depending on how audiophile you are, this thing will have either mediocre battery life or kind of bad battery life. All right, let's get into talking about what this thing sounds like. All right, I've strung this long enough. The user experience stuff is not where this thing excels. But what does this thing sound like? All right, hardware-wise, this thing is rocking an AKM4493S DAC, if that means anything to you. I will say that having listened to a lot of digital audio players, I find that the DAC that is included in them makes basically no difference. But what does make a difference is that this thing's got tubes in it. They are a Raytheon tube. It's new old stock. They're actually, that's right, tube amplifiers in here. And that's what makes this thing interesting. Now, you have the option of listening to these things on tubes or on solid state. And in fact, with the tubes, you've got two different modes, which we'll talk about. But it is interesting. You can listen to this as your normal solid state digital audio player if you want, or you can engage the tubes, which does cut down the battery life a little bit, but it gives you the light show, gives you a little bit of extra warmth, physically, actually literally warmth. And it does change the sound, which again, I promise we'll talk about. But the other things I normally talk about, sound quality, the things that are more commonly noticeable between digital audio players are going to be power output and noise floor. The power output in this guy is actually pretty good. On standard 3.5 millimeter, they claim 250 milliwatts at 32 ohms. A lot of the audio players I've been using are around 100, 150 milliwatts of output power. And even on those, like that's plenty for me to drive things like my Sennheiser HD600s. So at 250 milliwatts of power on this guy, I don't think anyone's going to have any problem with most headphones. It's not going to drive your most demanding stuff, but you know, it's not bad. On 4.4 mil balance connector, that's where you typically get more power. And that's definitely the case here with the N3 Ultra. You get 600 milliwatts of power. Which is pretty good. That's pretty good. It's not top of the class, but that's a lot. In fact, a lot of people have been talking about this guy. I'll just bring this in briefly. This is the Modhouse Tungsten. People have been talking about you need speaker amplifiers to drive that thing. I think a lot of that is overstated. On this little player, on 4.4 mil balance, so with that 600 milliwatts of power, at max power, I got that thing, and on max gain, on high gain, I got the Modhouse Tungsten to be at like my listening levels, all right? I didn't need it to be louder. So technically this thing can run a tungsten. If you're using a lot of EQ or you like to listen loud, maybe you'd still be unsatisfied. But for me, it was okay. Okay. And then the last thing I'll mention spec-wise is the output impedance. They claim it is 0.5 ohm on 3.5 mil and 1 ohm on balanced, which is pretty good. That just means that if you're connecting this thing to really sensitive IMs that can have their frequency response shifted by having output impedance, you're not going to have to worry about this. This thing should sound nice and clean. And the other thing that happens, or that impacts like sensitive IMs, is the noise floor, which just means like kind of like background hiss that you can sometimes pick up on a really sensitive earphone. Most headphones and most digital audio players, you're not going to pick it up. But if you're listening to something like a Campfire, Audio Andromeda, Aura, you might pick it up, especially on the balance connector. And then this guy, I would say with my Aura, with most IMs, I didn't hear it, but with my Aura, it was easy to pick up on the 3.5 mil. On the 4.4 mil, I would say that the noise floor is very audible, to the point that it was a little bit distracting. but I don't know. I kind of expect that, to be honest, with the Aura. There are some audio players that have no audible noise floor. Again, this Hibby is an example. This is the Hibby R8. But here with the N3 Ultra, it is a pretty noticeable noise floor, again, but only with really sensitive IMs. The other thing that I'll mention, and I already kind of talked about this, is that the N3 Pro did have some really audible ringing. If I plug in that Campfire Audio Aura into this player, especially unbalanced, there's just like a constant ringing coming from the tubes. Whereas here with the N3 Ultra, they solved that. I don't have any of those problems. In fact, even if I was like tapping on the player, trying to make it ring, trying to elicit some microphonics from it, man, didn't pick it up at all. So that was pretty good. All right, so that's kind of like the basic general stuff, but let's dive in and talk about what those tubes actually sound like, okay? Because I keep mentioning this, the tubes actually do make a sound difference. But it's still pretty subtle, I'll be honest, okay? In fact, I was kind of curious if the difference was a difference that I could measure. Now, I don't have hardware, or at least I don't know how to measure the hardware itself directly, but what I do have, obviously, is the ability to measure IMs. So what I did was I used this thing as a DAC for my computer, and then connected my IMs to this, and then measured my IMs. So I was basically measuring like the output, sort of the transducer level end result of this. And what I measured was that when I engage the tube, and here's how you do it. You swipe down this little thing, and you can engage the tube by toggling this on. Again, I got to plug in an IM apparently for this thing to actually let me do it. Let's plug that IM. There you go. So tube mode is engaged, right? I have to actually play something for it to light up. I don't know. Anyway, so you can engage tube mode or solid state mode. When I engage tube mode, in the measured frequency response of an IM, I actually saw that there was a little bit of a roll off in the lower bass, the very, very lower bass, and also a little bit of a lift in kind of the lower treble, upper mid-range area. The difference in the frequency response is really subtle. I expect that if I were to make that difference just using EQ, I probably wouldn't notice it, because it's really, like, we're talking maybe a decibel in the sub bass and less than a decibel difference in the upper mid range, but there was a little bit of a shift in the tonality. Now here with the, even when you've got the tube mode enabled, there's also this option to toggle the tube timbre. And you can see that it says the word modern there. If I toggle it, it'll go to classic. Toggling into modern, it seems to correct that. So it seems to fill in, again, that 1 decibel of missing sub bass, and maybe reduce that upper mid-range glare that it adds to it. Which again are both subtle changes, but it does, to my ear, noticeably kind of like cancel out some of the sound difference that I get switching into the tube mode, but not all of it. My guess is what they're doing is that when they switch to the tube amplification mode, those differences in the frequency response are real. Like, that's just what happens when you go through the different amplification mode. And then my guess is that by engaging the modern, oh, sorry, I just went back. By engaging the modern tube timbre, I'm guessing that they're using digital signal processing, DSP, to kind of correct for it and make it sound more like the solid state amplifier. Which, I mean, if that's what you're after, it does. It does sound a little bit more like the solid state. Now, that said, it doesn't sound entirely like the solid state, because that's not the only difference that you're getting with the tubes. The other thing that I was able to measure, I was different once, you know, at the IM end of this whole chain, is that regardless of whether I was using modern or classic timbre, the tubes were introducing a significant second order harmonic distortion to it, which is kind of what you want with the tube amplifier, okay? So while I'm using the words, it's introducing distortion to the sound. That might sound like a bad thing. That second order harmonic distortion injection is kind of the thing that people generally like with tube amplifiers. And it was cool to see that I could actually measure the difference at the IM level using the N3 Ultra. So to my ear, what does that actually sound like? It just sounds like a little bit softer of a sound, a little bit more laid back of a sound, I suppose, but also not necessarily a warmer, darker sound, okay? Because again, if anything, the tilt of the frequency response when engaging the tube was the opposite, because It dipped the bass a little bit and raised the upper mid-range a little bit, just a smidge. But it's still nonetheless, I think, because I'm guessing that addition of the second order harmonics, it does give it this kind of more laid back sound that can be kind of nice. It can be kind of nice. But here's what I'm going to say about this. It's a very subtle difference, okay? This is the biggest difference I've ever heard in a digital audio player, going from one audio player to another, is engaging this thing's tubes. It's noticeable, but it's still really pretty stinking subtle. You're gonna get, like, if you're going from one IM to another, that difference, even IMs that sound kind of similar, are gonna be like a 10 times bigger difference than what the difference you're gonna get out of this thing by engaging the tube mode. So, I don't know. People are definitely into tailoring the sound of their audio experience with a digital audio player, sources, amplifiers, DACs, and stuff like that. And to that end, the N3 Ultra does have a noticeable difference to my ear. So it's not just hypothetical. It is real. But still, I would say that, at least for my priorities, if I'm looking for a difference in sound, I'm definitely gonna focus on the IM or the headphone before I focus on the very subtle difference that you get out of here. That said, again, it is a real difference. I appreciate that. And there are things about the experience on this guy that I do quite like. I like the simple pared back functionality. I like the glowing of the tubes. Oh, look, it's actually glowing. Interesting. I have a feeling that's the real glow from the tubes, and that the brighter glow that I was getting earlier is LEDs. They could have left it like that. That's nice. I like that. That's subtle. Anyway, I like some of those experiential things of this audio player. I do find it fun. And honestly, if the battery life was better, if this was like a 20-hour battery life, I could probably forgive some of those problems a little bit more so. But as it is, I don't know. The N3 Ultra, it's a fun player. It's got some quirks. I'm gonna give it 3 stars out of 5. If you want to check it out, I've got it linked down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews. We now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit.